Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello, this is Gerard. Welcome to another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. Before we get started today, if my voice sounds a little funny or if I end up coughing at times, it's simply because I'm fighting against the flu, and so this may not be the best at times, but we'll see if we're going to get through it. Anyways, this is the show that asks, what if we took one of St. Paul's letters to America and changed the name on it as if it was sent to America? Each program we talk about the two things people often say never to talk about: religion and politics. And the objective is to explore how matters of faith fit in society and how to balance the interests of government and religious beliefs. Specifically, we look at an issue present in our lives and our society today and take a look at it through the prism of St. Paul's writings. As we do, we always bear in mind a motto: love and kindness through the light of truth. Hopefully that is what we do here. Today we are going to talk about religious persecution and the growing trend towards accepting the concept of it and even the practice of it. And we are going to do it through the prism of a letter that St. Paul wrote that might not necessarily seem to lend itself to this topic. St. Paul wrote various letters in captivity, and one might naturally think that we would choose one of those, and instead, we've chosen a letter of his to Titus, which in part reads, "Beloved, the grace of God has appeared, saving all, and training us to reject godless ways and worldly desires, and to live temperately, justly, and devoutly in this age, as we await the blessed hope, the appearance of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us to deliver us from all lawlessness, and to cleanse for himself a people as his own, eager to do what is good." Now, part of this particular reading that struck me was when he says that we need to reject worldly desires. And that is our focal point for the program today: rejecting worldly desires. What has that to do with religious persecution? Well, quite simply, it would be the idea that people who tend to get caught up in religious persecution don't benefit from having a balance or harmony in their lives. They get caught up in worldly desires. They put a great deal of emphasis on what is happening in the world around them and how they want to shape that world and the social affairs that exist in that world. And doing so makes them feel, to some extent, they feel an urge to attack anything that is outside of their idea of what the society would be like. And that can lend itself to religious persecution. There's a professor from the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga. His name is Winfred McKay. And in 2007, at a Pew Research forum event on this particular issue of religion and secularism and the American experience, he spoke about two different views of secularism. One he called a political secularism, and by that he meant something along the lines of the intent that the original founders of the country had in mind. A secularism where there was some type of a balance between religion and government, that the country, the government, the Congress would not establish any official church state, but that outside of that limited restriction, religion would be allowed to flourish. As a matter of fact, even up until the 1830s, some states did have established religions and established churches. The original founders of the country simply felt that there would not be a national church. But if people in a particular state wanted to do that, wanted to have their own church in their own state, well, all of that was up to the particular states. That changed later on after the Civil War, where with the 14th Amendment, when the rights of citizens on a national level were then extended to the states. But in any event, the point is that the original founders did view what's known as the Establishment Clause in the Constitution, which says Congress shall make no law establishing religion. The original founders did understand that provision in a rather limited way. And so when you have this balance between government and the church, you have what then is what McKay calls political secularism. He says there's also another view of secularism, and that is philosophical secularism. And by that, what he means is that secularism then becomes a philosophy, and it is seen as the correct view of life, and that a society should organize itself around that core philosophy. Meaning that when you have a secularist view where there is no church, then that's what you make prevalent throughout your society. So it does not admit of a role for churches and religions in the public sphere. It is much more aggressive, much more antagonistic towards churches and religion. And that is, in fact, what we see being played out in our country today on a number of fronts. Just recently, November of this year, there was a hearing held on a nominee for a judicial appointment to the district court in Nebraska. His name is Brian Boucher. And Mr. Boucher was an attorney, I believe he's an attorney in private practice out in Nebraska. In any event, he's a member of the Knights of Columbus. And he's been a member of the Knights of Columbus since he was 18. Well, being a member of the Knights of Columbus raised concerns for several senators. Senator Kamala Harris from California and Senator Mazi Hirono from Hawaii asked him a series of questions dealing with the Knights of Columbus. And one of the questions was, were you aware, they submitted these in writing to him and then he had to answer them. One question was, were you aware that the Knights of Columbus opposed a woman's right to choose when you joined the organization? So when he was 18, did you know that? There was a female commenter who wrote that she's quite familiar, as a Catholic woman, I'm quite familiar with faith-based charity activities organized by her parish's Knights of Columbus group. And she equated this question to, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Knights of Columbus? In other words, hearkening back to the McCarthy hearings, in the McCarthy era, when people are asked, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? People in Hollywood were blackballed on that basis. Are we going through a new stage of McCarthyism? Only this time, it's not the Communist Party that is under scrutiny. It's anyone's involvement with the Catholic Church or the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic organization. These particular questions, there were a series of questions along these similar lines. He was asked whether or not he would recuse himself on any case in which one of the views expressed by the Knights of Columbus would come up. That might take him out of a huge realm of cases, because the Knights of Columbus might express opinions on a whole number of things. At any rate, the spokesperson for the Knights of Columbus, Kathleen Blomquist, commented that our country's sad history of anti-Catholic bigotry contributed to the founding of the Knights of Columbus. And we are proud of the many Catholics who overcame this hurdle to contribute so greatly to our country. We were extremely disappointed to see that one's commitment to Catholic principles through membership of the Knights of Columbus, a charitable organization that adheres to and promotes Catholic teachings, would be viewed as a disqualifier from public service in this day and age. This harkens back to questions that were raised about John F. Kennedy and the bias that existed against him when he was running for president back in 1960. Many people raised the question, he's a Catholic, he's going to be led by, whatever the Pope in Rome happens to say. He's not going to be free and independent. We can't trust him to be the president. It harkens back to that kind of viewpoint. It seems that, in this day and age, when we are told that we need to get by all kinds of biases, when we need to accept everyone and anyone, regardless of what we may think, we cannot say anything negative, let alone act in any way negatively, towards people of a different color, a different ethnicity, which is, of course, perfectly fine and just and right, that we cannot, feel differently about people who express homosexual tendencies and beliefs, people who express transgender, tendencies and beliefs. That not only must we not discriminate against them, but we must accept them. In this day and age, when any kind of discrimination in any form is looked down upon, nonetheless, how is it that we seem to be able to harbor or accept some kind of discrimination against Catholics? Is that not, in fact, what is going on here? It may be that we're going forward in terms of reducing discrimination. We may be progressing in that regard with every other sphere of our society, perhaps with one lone exception against Catholics or Christians. In any event, some of the other questions he was asked, if he was confirmed with Mr. Boucher and his membership in the Knights of Columbus, he was asked, well, the Knights of Columbus have taken a number of extreme positions. For example, they were one of the top contributors to California's Proposition 8 campaign, which would ban same-sex marriage. Some of the questions included references to the fact that the Knights of Columbus was an all-male society. And he was asked whether he agreed with the statement made by the Supreme Knight, Carl Anderson, who said about abortion that it amounted to the killing of the innocent on a massive scale, at least 40 million deaths so far. And he was asked, whether or not he agreed with all of that. And it seems that there is a viewpoint towards abortion that it is not killing, that it is just, it is proper, and that no other view will be accepted. And if you have a different view, whether it's based on Catholic religious principles or otherwise, you are not to be accepted. Well, why not? I mean, is it not always true that a multitude of viewpoints and beliefs is a good thing because it may lead more towards getting to the truth, arriving at the truth, instead of going off course, rather than, allowing only certain views or a limited number of viewpoints. In any event, if we go back again to this letter of St. Paul, he says that we need to reject worldly desires. Now, when he wrote that letter, in one sense, what he was talking about was rejecting worldly desires. Turn your lives towards God, turn your lives towards Christ. But, so it may be an exhortation to the super pious people to live very devout lives. But on the other hand, it's just simply to not take this world too seriously. To view this world as not so important. That there's a higher plane of things that should take a place in our thinking as the most important. And it's that kind of thinking that gives us a balance, does it not? if there's something above us, something that is more important, then it just seems that, human living can be more peaceful, that we have more tolerance for one another. We're more able to extend kindnesses and graces and be tolerant of one another. Whereas if our eyesight, if our visions are limited to just what is, here in front of us and around us, then, we need to fashion that, in accordance with what we want. And if not, then we become more intolerant. It might be that the very people who are, espousing the virtues of accepting everyone, of not being discriminatory towards anyone, are in fact suggesting that we, abandon faith and religion, which may in fact be the very thing that leads us to be more tolerant. Professor McKay, who I talked about before, had mentioned that religion seems to have been, in the history of America, the very thing that has been at the heart of many of the important social movements in our country. He said, for example, that the abolition of slavery was, in large measure, or to a great degree, based on people with religious beliefs that slavery was wrong. The civil rights movement was another thing that he pointed to. And for example, Martin Luther King, he brought him up as well. Martin Luther King would quote from the Bible and would speak about American justice and the need for us all to be free. But he could talk about religion and politics in the same vein, and the one supported the other. The fact that every person had an individual dignity coming from God was the very reason why, the principles in our Constitution and in our government that everybody should be treated equally have meaning. These things are consistent. They coexist. To banish one to having no role with the other may in fact lead us exactly to an opposite direction of really where we want to go. But this one particular example with this Brian Boucher, for example, this was just very recently, this was in the last month, but it's not an isolated case. Earlier, back in last year, there was a judicial nominee named Amy Coney Barrett. She was a law professor at Notre Dame. And her case was actually pretty famous. She was nominated to the Circuit Court of Appeals. And when being questioned by Dianne Feinstein, senator from California, Senator Feinstein said to her that, religion, if it means anything, at least to Senator Feinstein, meant belief in certain dogma. And she said that Ms. Barrett, from her writings and things that she had said before the hearing, she said to Ms. Barrett that dogma lives loudly within you. And that's a concern when you come to big issues that large numbers of people have fought for years in this country. Amy Barrett had spoken and written about Catholic principles, how she believed in them, how she thought they were right. Things like the sanctity of life, for example. And, certainly some may ask, what is wrong with the sanctity of life? But that's another subject. But the dogma lives loudly within you, and that's of concern. The dogma, the Catholic dogma, the Catholic principles, Catholic beliefs live loudly within you. And that's a concern. Why is it a concern? Why is it troubling people? Feinstein actually said, many of us up on this panel are uncomfortable with you. Why does it make other people uncomfortable when they come across somebody of faith? The Catholic faith, the Christian faith, is one based on love for other people. And nevertheless, this makes certain people feel uncomfortable. Why? Why? The answer to that question may explain a lot about why we're facing religious persecution. in certain degrees, in increasing degrees in this country, and we'll get to more of that even later. But there was another senator at that time, Sheldon Whitehouse. He was a Democratic senator from Rhode Island, and he said, to sit here and pretend that there is no role for people's personal and private views when they get to the court, well, it's just too preposterous. It's just silly. And so therefore, those religious views matter. And that if you have religious views, it's going to affect how you judge cases. And therefore, we need to be able to, sift through and censor and examine religious views and give people religious tests to determine whether or not those views comport with ours as to whether or not we're going to allow them to sit on a court. We're going to now so we're going to pick certain religious views that are acceptable and not acceptable. Is that where we're going now in this country? Then who decides what those religious views are that are acceptable? Are we not going down a very dangerous road? In fact, one of the big areas of questioning that Amy Barrett faced was on a paper that she wrote with a professor. She wrote, as a law student in 1998, a paper, and she wrote it along with a gentleman by the name of John Garvey. He is now president of the Catholic University of America. In any event, the paper from 20 years ago asked whether or not a Catholic judge should recuse himself or herself from death penalty cases if she would be unable to impartially uphold the law because of religious convictions that the death penalty was wrong. And the thrust of the paper was to say that judges cannot, nor should they try, to align our legal system with the church's moral teaching. Nevertheless, the paper was read sort of in the opposite way, this at least according to an article appearing in The Atlantic magazine, and that she was being criticized because of a view that this paper said people's religious views should trump the law. Of course, that's not what the paper said, but whatever. But the committee was obviously troubled by Barrett's Catholic convictions on abortion, same-sex marriage, and other issues. Barrett repeatedly said that she would uphold the law, but they didn't seem to believe her. And as Garvey and Barrett wrote years ago, it seems plainly inconsistent to suggest that Catholics, simply by virtue of being Catholics, are disqualified from serving as judges. In fact, 5 of the 9 justices currently on the U.S. Supreme Court are Catholics. Barrett, Garvey quoted the late Justice William Rehnquist as saying, the issue is whether or not people come to the court with beliefs and so forth that shape their convictions. And of course, that's true. But Rehnquist said that proof that a justice's mind at the time he joined the court was a complete tabula rasa would be evidence of lack of qualification rather than lack of qualification. So the fact that people's views are shaped by certain convictions they hold is basically unavoidable. In any event, this is where judicial nominee approvals seem to be going. That people are now put to religious tests. As I said, the last one just simply being this person who was a member of the Knights of Columbus. Of course, the Knights of Columbus, I mean, it's not like the man was a member of a group that held terrorist tendencies. And the Knights of Columbus is active in 17 countries. In 2017, its members carried out more than 75 million hours of volunteer work and raised more than $185 million for charitable purposes. It should be I think this is something also that the spokesperson for the night said. It should be something that's seen as a commendable endeavor, a commendable membership, rather than being something that is troubling. But nevertheless, we seem to be turning things quite a bit upside down. Now, there's another, of course, very famous recent argument in the law that has dealt with this whole area of religious persecution. That involves the recent federal legislation dealing with health care, commonly known as Obamacare. And the most, I guess, contentious part of Obamacare, at least from the standpoint of religious persecution, was this whole subject of the HHS mandate. The mandate required that religious organizations, whether it be hospitals or universities, that they provide health care that included contraceptives, abortifacients, and so forth. And, of course, as is known, there's a case by Hobby Lobby, which sought to have that law, just sought to be excluded from that law because they were a privately funded company, but nevertheless a closely held company, where there's just, a family or a certain closely held group of people who owned the company and held certain religious views. And if these people held religious views against contraception and abortion, should they be forced to pay for it? And then, of course, there was the case that came after that, possibly more famous, the Little Sisters of the Poor, a charitable group of nuns who provided hospice care, nursing home care, medical care for people of all walks of life, of all faiths and beliefs and so forth. And they didn't want to be able to fund these things or have to fund these things. As nuns, as Catholic nuns, this was against their core principles, things they had devoted their whole lives to. And they didn't want to be required by a government to help anybody receive, even if it's only by a pill, an abortion. It goes to the very core beliefs of these people. In both of these cases, the government sought to impose its will on these groups and force them to agree to abortifacient drugs and pay for them. Why would a government want to force people to do this unless it's along the lines of what we've been talking about? You've got a philosophical secularism that some people feel is the proper perspective to have, as opposed to a political secularism. The political secularism, where religion and government can coexist, is to a lot of people in need of change. We need to wipe that out. We need to, instead of maintaining a wall of separation between church and state, we are now tearing down that wall, and we are going to have some unified form of society in which church and state are in line with each other, but the state gets to decide really what the proper views on questions including abortion and the preservation of life. The state gets to decide these questions, and so you have a secular philosophy, you have a secular view of life, you have a secular religion of sorts. It becomes now the state religion. When, the Bill of Rights says, Congress shall not establish a religion, we may in fact be doing precisely that. And the religion that's being imposed is a religion of no church, a religion of secularism or atheism. This is why a lot of people feel that as a Catholic or as a Christian, we're becoming increasingly persecuted in this country. There's an effort, there's an endeavor to squeeze people out with these types of religious views. So, in any event, both of these cases stand out for that, Hobby Lobby and the Little Sisters of the Poor. And I guess as much as anything else, it's what happened after these cases are decided that's indicative of what's going on. The question is there an inability to tolerate people with religious views? We still have to go after these people, even if the court rules in their favor. The Little Sisters of the Poor, for example, have faced continuing attacks even after they won at the Supreme Court. And they won at the Supreme Court in a huge fashion. I mean, the Little Sisters of the Poor won in a 9-0 decision at the U.S. Supreme Court. Still, California afterwards, passed a new law, and the Little Sisters are back in court again, fighting on the very same issue as before. They're trying to be forced to, fund these things that they don't want to have to fund. And, now it's not a federal law that's at issue, but it's a state law. And, the question, even after the U.S. Supreme Court, in very convincing fashion, says that something is wrong, people nevertheless pursue it anyway. Why? As I said before, maybe that we're becoming more intolerant rather than tolerant. So, in any event, this is increasingly becoming what is going on. If we go back again to St. Paul, and when he says, need to reject worldly desires, would that not lead us to be a little bit more at peace, a little bit more tolerant? He also then says, and these concepts go together. He talks about training us to reject godless ways and worldly desires, and to live temperately, justly, and devoutly. Temperately. There is hardly very much temperance in these efforts to go after people, like the Little Sisters of the Poor, who everybody knows it is so against everything they believe to try to force them to do this, and nevertheless try to force them to do this. Why? How is that living temperately? In any event, and by the way, would it not be a good idea for all of us to follow this recommendation from St. Paul? What is wrong with living temperately? Would we not all get along a little bit better if we live temperately rather than with such a rage? There's a video I saw just the other day on the internet. It's a guy who went into, I guess, a vape shop, and he was wearing some kind of a Trump hat. And the person behind the counter, the employee of the store, had serious objection to it. And anyway, it ended up where this employee of the store just couldn't control himself. He was telling this person to get out of the store. He was hurling obscenities at this person, and he was jumping around and just couldn't stand. And he was screaming, and he was in some kind of a rage. It's like he couldn't stand to be in the presence of this guy. He wanted this guy to simply leave. He couldn't stand to be near him, simply because. And he thought, because if you're wearing a Trump hat, this guy, Trump is a racist. He's this, he's that, and other. And he just couldn't control himself. It's the same thing we see on college campuses, where people need now to have safe zones. We can't accept anybody who has different views from our own. They invade our safe space. We have to have only one view that's allowed. There is no tolerance. There is no temperance. If people follow, what would be wrong for everybody to follow St. Paul's, recommendation to live temperately? We Would we not be more tolerant? Would we not be more at peace with one another? Would we not be able to be kinder to one another? Instead, we're becoming increasingly at each other's throats. It's said over and over again, this country is becoming more divided than ever. And that's, in fact, what we're seeing. There's a famous quote by Cardinal George from Chicago, and it was all about this whole issue of religious persecution. And Cardinal George reportedly said, in fact, he did say, as he acknowledged after, that I expect to die in bed. My successor will die in prison, and his successor will die a martyr in the public square. That was quoted and we re-quoted, and it's been talked about a lot as something expressive of the state of affairs in this country today. And when Cardinal George actually acknowledged that he said this, he said that he was trying to express in an overly dramatic fashion what the complete secularization of our society could bring. So there's a little bit of a caveat there. But nevertheless, obviously enough, he was fearful of where this country was going. Now there's a following line to his quote that is often never picked up. But then he also expressed hope. And after saying that, I will die, I expect to die in bed, my successor in prison, and his successor in martyr in the public square, he said his successor will pick up the shards of a ruined society and slowly help rebuild civilization, as the church has done so often in human history. There is always hope. There is always the good that will come. And why? Because people in the church cling to Christ, as St. Paul said, I preach Christ and Him crucified. We cling to Christ. And why not? He is the culmination of the Old Testament. He is the institution of the New Covenant. He is, to where, human history pointed before His coming and where it's been pointed ever since, which is why our calendar was based on His life. He is the way, the truth, and the life. He is our path to salvation. There is always room for hope if we cling to these Catholic beliefs, these Catholic ideas, which, of course, a lot of people, for some reason or another, now seem to feel uncomfortable with. These big national cases that I've been talking about, they're not the only ones. This is creeping into our society in a lot of different ways, smaller ways. There was a teacher in New Jersey, and he was suspended for giving a student a Bible. There was a football coach in Washington who was put on leave for saying a prayer on the field at the end of a game. There was a fire chief in Atlanta who was fired for self-publishing a book defending Christian moral teaching. There was a Marine who was court-martialed for pasting a Bible verse above her desk. This is, there are more and more examples like this out there. These things that are happening. Why? Why are people feeling uncomfortable with this? There are students that are facing this as well. One college student, or one state college, rejected a Christian student, saying that the medical field is not the place for religion. The medical field is not the place for religion. Well, that may come as news to a lot of Catholic hospitals around the country. And in fact, a lot of people might, in fact, when perhaps they're facing an illness that could take their life, might find a lot of consolation and solace in the idea that there is a afterlife, that there is a God. Why should religion be divorced from medicine, of all things? And why would someone have the view that these cannot go together? Why is it disqualifying to serve in a religious field? Simply because you're religious. what kind of a viewpoint is there? If it's not one of secular philosophy, what kind of viewpoint says that medicine is not the place for religion? If medicine is not the place for religion, what profession is fit for religion? What roles in society can religious people play anywhere? I mean, this is a philosophical view that seems to admit no room for people of religious feelings. There's a college student, another college student, who was denied religion because he was denied admission to the college because he brought up religion. Disqualified. You bring up religion, you're disqualified. You are what? A dangerous person? You are what? Going to be a disturbing influence to others on the college campus? You can't even bring up religion. You can't even talk about whether there's a God or not. You can't even talk about it. Well, I mean, are we, yes, are we, going to Nazi Germany stage of affairs, where if you bring up a certain type of religion, if you're a Jew, there's no room for you. You can't even be alone. You don't even deserve to live. There are Muslim countries that don't admit any other religious beliefs. Here in the United States, we've always been a pluralistic society where everybody gets to be admitted, and every faith and every religion gets to be accepted, and so forth. That's the cornerstone of who we are. There's a freedom that there's a freedom that has been part of our identity and who we are for so long. That is the reason why so many people have wanted to come here, because principally because then they don't face that persecution elsewhere. They come here because they don't face the persecution that they do face elsewhere. That's the reason why they come here. Well, are we starting to get away from that? Why would that be a good thing? Why is it a good thing to change who we are and who we've been when we've been so attractive to so many people for so long? There's another university student who was expelled for her faith. Expelled for her faith. Wow. You're not supposed to be on campus because you're a faithful person and maybe you express it. That is, of course, so disturbing. If you express religious, views of one sort or another, that's just so disturbing to so many people who can't possibly have that, especially when the religion, is one that says that we have to love everybody else, turn the other cheek, and be kind to everybody. Can't have that at all. So disturbing. Another was failed for refusing to agree that Christianity is false. Yeah, no penalty there. Failed. You must agree. Now, what is involved in that? Why would anybody tell a person of faith, of a Christian faith, that they must agree that Christianity is false? Why would you do that? Would you take a Muslim person and say to them that the Quran is false, that Muhammad was, some type of a blasphemer? Would you force that person to do that? Would not a faithful Muslim die? Would he not die first? Yeah. Why? There have been Christian martyrs in the past that have died because they don't want to deny that Christ is God. Are we going to get there? Why would you force somebody to do this? There's a cruelty in that. Obviously it's something that somebody holds dear, and you want to strip them of it. Why? There's a cruelty in that. There's no reason to do it. If you happen to think that Christianity is false, but you must require that other people agree with you. Oh, excuse me. That's tolerant? No, that's the height of intolerance, which is, as we were suggesting before. that it's Christian beliefs and Christian principles that lead people to be intolerant. Perhaps it's these secular views and secular beliefs that are leading people to become intolerant. They say that, we can fashion a world of the highest values and, the highest principles, and we can self-create it on the human level. We don't need God. But yet, are they doing that? Or are they doing, the exact opposite? In 2013, the Family Research Council and the Liberty Institute put out a report. They had done a survey the year before where they had 600 cases of religious persecution. Then in 2013, it was 1,200. It had doubled in 1 year. I don't know what's been since. One can only hope it's not gotten worse, but perhaps it has. In any event, doubled in just 1 year. They talked about there was a case in which a college student was asked twice to remove her cross. You got to remove the cross. You got to remove the cross. Why? Why do you have to remove the cross? Because it might offend somebody else. Well, this girl who was told she had to remove her cross was offended by this person who was demanding that she remove the cross. I mean, how can you? They're not always a risk that. When you try not to offend one person, you might be offending somebody else. And yet, the Christians always seem to be the people that we don't care if we offend. It's an NFL running back, former NFL running back, Craig James, fired from Fox Sports. He was a sports analyst. He was fired. He made a statement about 15 months before about gay marriage in the political debate, apparently taking a religious view on gay marriage that it perhaps was wrong. And he was fired. Not acceptable. You can't have that type of religious belief. These cases go on and on and on. They're simply all over the place. There's more. There's a Florida charitable organization for 31 years providing food to the hungry in Lake City, Florida. And one day a state agriculture department official showed up and told them they would not be allowed to receive USDA food, which they were counting on, which they relied on for their distributions to the poor. They weren't going to be receiving any food unless they removed portraits of Christ and the Ten Commandments and a banner that read, Jesus is Lord. So they're providing a public service. They're providing food for the poor. They're doing something that the state otherwise wasn't doing. But they believe in Jesus and they believe in God, and they can't. This is what the state is telling them. They can't. They have to stop. Why? Why do we want to do this? What prompts state officials to insist that somebody give up their religious views? Why? There's another case we have in 2011, Mark Mackey and Brett Coronado arrested and charged with misdemeanor offenses in California. What did they do? They were reading the Bible outside a DMV location. And that was illegal, according to a certain law. Well, their case came before a Superior Court judge, and he found the men not guilty of any offenses. And he also said that the law was very likely unconstitutional. But nevertheless, somebody passed this law that you can't read the Bible outside in public. And they made it a crime to do so. Why? Why do we want to do this? There was a senior master sergeant named Philip Monk, and he was posted at Lackland Air Force Base. And his commander had plans to severely punish an instructor because the instructor had expressed religious objections to homosexuality. Well, as I say, Master Sergeant Philip Monk objected to that punishment for this instructor. So his commander, during this conversation that they were having, ordered him to share his personal views on homosexuality. He was then relieved of his position because he didn't agree with his commander's position on gay marriage. So then he was supposed to later on meet with an Air Force investigator. When he meant to meet with the investigator, he was immediately read his Miranda rights and accused of providing false statements in a conversation that he'd had with some Fox Network reporter. Here's a man with a 19-year spotless record, being booted out of the military, chastised, put through some type of a procedural ringer, if nothing else, simply because he didn't agree with the fact that gay marriage was supposed to be accepted. You have to accept the views of the government on such a thing as gay marriage. And if your religion says that gay marriage is wrong, then your religion is wrong. Well, is that not the definition then of a religion? Is not the state creating its own religion? And if you disagree with it, you suffer punishment. Are we not establishing, contrary to the Bill of Rights, a state religion? Yeah, another case. Let's see. What we got? National Park Service had instituted a rule. If you want to use a river, some waterways in a national park for performing a baptism, you had to get a permit. Well, people objected. Why do people object? Because if you have to apply for a permit, you could be denied a permit. You would then have the government having the right to decide when and where, at least to some extent, people can or should not be baptized. But nevertheless, the National Park Service tried to do this. There was objections that were raised and they quickly backed off, but they tried. Let's see. Now I've got another case. The Florida professor. Florida Atlantic University. A professor. Told Ryan Rotella to write Jesus Christ's name on a piece of paper and stomp on it. You had to write Jesus Christ's name on a piece of paper and stomp on it. Rotella, the student, defiantly refused. Now, this is a pretty bold act for a student to deny a professor. The professor is a person of authority. Professor controls his grade and so forth. Students at something of a disadvantage, to be sure. Nevertheless, he defiantly refused. Well, a formal disciplinary action was started against the student. But then the word got out of what was happening. Christians became enraged. The university heard it from all sides. And, the disciplinary action against the student was quashed. The professor was put on administrative leaves, but he was not fired. But this is again the kind of thing that people are facing in our country today. A professor feels empowered to demand that a student write Jesus Christ's name on a piece of paper and do what? Stomp on it? What possible educational purpose is served in doing that? Is the professor not simply acting out his own beliefs and his own imperiousness? Why does he insist that he's got the right to control another person to such a degree that he has to deny his own God? Is this not something that people face in tyrannical states? This is what kids are going through on college campuses. Why? Why do the people in our day and age feel that religion cannot be tolerated? There is an air of religious persecution in our society today that is going to continue to be acted out. Election that was just held, Democrats took back the House. Those two cases I mentioned before, Hobby Lobby, Little Sisters of the Poor, were based on a law called the Religious Freedom Reform Act, I have that correctly. Anyways, it was a law that was passed in 1993, signed by President Bill Clinton. Tremendous bipartisan support, both Republicans and Democrats. And it said that if there were laws that put an excessive burden on somebody's religious beliefs, that they were not to be allowed. And so these two cases, two Supreme Court cases, justified their holdings based on that law. Well, apparently there's already talk among House Democrats in crafting new legislation to gut that law. Likely, won't become law because it would have to get by the Senate. Senate's Republican controlled right now. It probably wouldn't get anywhere near the votes needed to overcome a veto by President Trump if that occurred, which would be likely. But they're talking about, the House Democrats are talking about, why would they want that? Why would they want religious freedom, protections for religious freedom to be gutted? Why? Because there is a philosophical secularism that is becoming more and more prevalent in our country today. It is not the political secularism that we have known for much of our history. It is now a philosophical secularism. It is, in effect, a secular church, an established state church, in effect. And so Christian views are not allowed. Contrary not only to St. Paul's words about rejecting worldly desires and living temperately, so at least keep those worldly desires in check, to live, with tolerance for other people. Not only does it go against that, but it also goes against a few other things he said in that same passage that we read at the beginning of this program, which is, the grace of God has appeared. Jesus Christ appeared on the earth in human form. Let's if you can get past that, if you can answer C.S. Lewis's 3 questions about who Christ was, if you can go over, if you can get past why the Roman Empire fell without a war, why they succumbed to Christianity without a war, how the great and mighty, powerful Roman Empire was conquered by a little religion, how so many people, died in the Colosseum and so forth, how Christianity has survived for 2,000 years. If you can get by so many other questions as to who Christ was and why he was and so forth, maybe you can believe in philosophical secularism. But the fact is, for many of us, we cannot. We believe St. Paul when he says, the grace of God has appeared on this earth, saving all, training us to reject godless ways, godlessness, worldly desires, and to live temperately, justly, and devoutly in this age, as we await the blessed hope, the appearance of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us to deliver us from all lawlessness, and to cleanse for himself a people as his own, eager to do what is good. I suggest that we would be well advised to listen to this message from St. Paul, to keep it close, not forget it, try to follow it. If we would do that, my view, we would be a more tolerant rather than intolerant nation, one that would be more balanced and more at peace with itself. So, until next time, we thank you for listening. We hope you join us again for another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.